But who is he? Where's the doctor?
That's him. Right in front of you. That's the doctor.
What do you mean that's the doctor? Doctor who?
Part of what's remarkable about the Christmas Invasion is that it's a great, big, important episode. Not only is it the first Doctor Who Christmas special, the beginning of a BBC institution, it's also the first full-length adventure to feature David Tennant in the title role, and so it comes with a lot of expectations. Whereas most of Davies' Christmas specials in the future tended to be rather lighter affairs, enjoyable runarounds tended rather squarely at the kind of people who don't tune in every week, the Christmas Invasion is a pretty big deal. It's a vitally important part of Davies' Doctor Who, and one that really lays out a general blueprint for where he wants to take the series over the next few years. The fact that so much of this winds up tying back into the final stories of the Davies era, The End of Time, is quite striking on a rewatch. Russ T Davies tends to get a fair bit of criticism because his Christmas specials tend to be rather bombastic and simplistic, but that rather misses the point entirely. This isn't really television intended for a box set or yearly rotation. This is television designed to be followed by your elderly aunt with a dodgy hearing, or your grandfather who is struggling to stay awake, your cousin who wouldn't be called dead watching that show with a flying police box. And if anything, it might have got more people on board, and that can only be a positive thing. Moreover, there's a long-standing, rather odd Doctor Who tradition that the newly regenerated Doctor doesn't actually appear much in their first adventure. Much like David Tennant here, John Pertwee was asleep in his hospital bed for the most part of Spearhead from Space, while Peter Davison spent a distressingly high percentage of Castra Volva unconscious in a box. Sylvester McCoy and Paul McGann were recovering from amnesia for a good chunk of their debuts, while Colin Baker had to play the Doctor as borderline psychotic, for reasons that we'll charitably assume made sense at the time. Seriously, what were they thinking? Only Patrick Troughton, Tom Baker and Matt Smith are really allowed to hit the ground running with their Doctors, more or less fully recovering within minutes of their regenerations. Perhaps not coincidentally, Power of the Daleks and the 11th Hour are very much in the top tier of introductory stories, while Robot is a little story that benefits immensely from Tom Baker's immediate established performance. So then why doesn't every Doctor get to make their biggest, splashiest entrance possible? Why does Doctor Who so often seem to insist on sidelining its lead actor in the debut performance? Like most things in Doctor Who history, there hasn't really been a consistent reason why this has happened. One obvious possibility here is that the Doctor's reduced role in his debut story is essentially a stalling tactic, providing the creative team and the new lead actor with more time to figure out what the new incarnation will actually be like. In practice, however, the introductory story isn't the first one that a new Doctor films. In this instance, the Christmas Invasion was indeed David Tennant's first outing as the Doctor, but it was part of the same production block as the subsequent New Earth and Tooth and Claw, so everyone involved likely already had a fairly good sense of who the Doctor actually was going to be. Indeed, for all the new Doctor's protestations that he has no idea who he is, both Tennant and Russ T Davies display a clear sense of who this new incarnation's identity is from quite early on. David Tennant's take on the Doctor is decidedly different from Christopher Eccleston's. Eccleston did an admirable job in reincarnating the series, and his presence would be sorely missed, but his replacement isn't bad at all. Tennant's performance is slightly more eccentric, a little funnier, a bit wittier, and he obviously looks very different. It's difficult to measure who's better at this stage, of course, but Tennant's performance was spot on in this episode, and it'll be interesting to see how much his character evolves over the course of the next season. As portrayed here, he seems to be a much lighter, joyful incarnation than his predecessor. This is the Doctor who hugs his old friends and joins Rose for Christmas dinner, suggesting that the Ninth Doctor's no domestics rule no longer applies. Yet the darkness of the Ninth Doctor is not erased, but rather submerged, which arguably makes this incarnation more dangerous than his predecessor ever was. The Ninth Doctor wore his sorrow and his anger on his leather jacketed sleeve, but it's far harder to predict when the Tenth Doctor will shift from charismatic goofball to vengeful god. This Doctor is both an inversion and an extension of his previous self, and Harriet Jones learned later on how terrifying that combination can really be. All this talk of the Ninth Doctor helps suggest a likelier explanation of the Tenth Doctor's extended incapacitation, which is that it was for the benefit of those watching at home. After all, for a sizable chunk of the audience, Christopher Eccleston was their first Doctor they truly cared about. Half a year had elapsed between the parting of the ways and the Christmas Invasion, but it makes sense for this story to delay a while to pay its respect to the short-lived Ninth Doctor before forging ahead with his successor. Both Rose and Harriet Jones refer to Eccleston's incarnation as their Doctor, and Eccleston's legacy is properly acknowledged and put to rest when Tennant uses the word fantastic at the episode's end. This is a new Doctor, but he's still the same man, and the Christmas Invasion takes its time to convince the audience of that fact. In narrative terms, this handling of the transition fits well with the notion that regeneration really is akin to death. It makes sense that the Doctor can't blithely walk away from such a traumatic an experience. Still, what really sets apart the Christmas Invasion from previous post-regeneration stories is not the Doctor's protracted absence, again that's nothing new, but rather who steps into the spotlight when the Doctor isn't himself. The story is unique in the show's history that the previous incumbent companion has spanned the entirety of the previous Doctor's era, meaning she was well established as a Doctor himself. As Stephen Moffat has gone on record and is well noted, Rose was arguably the true protagonist of Doctor Who at this point, with the Doctor only reclaiming his position as the unquestioned star upon Billie Piper's departure. There's some precedent for this in the classic series, as one could argue that William Hartnell's original Doctor doesn't fully take on leading man duties until after the departure of original companions Ian and Barbara. This story explores at length what the Doctor's absence means to Rose, and what we see here doesn't reflect terribly well on her at all. All the initiative and verve that she displayed in the previous season deserts her here, and her lone coherent plan consists of hiding in the TARDIS and sitting out the possible destruction of Earth. I mean, really? It's only when Rose stands up before the Sycorax commander that she regains her resolve. Her attempt to bluff the invaders is doomed to failure, but at least she is willing to stand up and do what the Doctor would do, because she knows no one else will. Even so, this is where the problems with Rose really begin to surface for me. The Christmas invasion heavily plays up on the theme of abandonment here, as Rose breaks down in tears over the loss of, quote, her Doctor. But what sort of abandonment is this exactly? There's enough ambiguity here that one might interpret Rose's feeling for the Doctor as platonic. Given her backstory, it would make sense for her to see him as a surrogate father figure. But this episode shades heavily towards suggesting that Rose truly, properly loves the Doctor. Mickey is positioned in this story right where a jilted ex-lover would normally go, and a tearful Rose tells Jackie that he left me, both of which implies that there's a romantic dimension to the Doctor and Rose's relationship. Well, at least as far as Rose is concerned, anyway. In the midst of all this character work, it's a titular Yuletide invasion. The story feels something of a remix of Aliens of London and World War III, as to all of Rusty Davies' present-day alien invasion stories, to one extent or another. And the connection feels especially strong with the return of Harriet Jones and the heavy use of news broadcasts to add global scale to the threat. As director James Hawes manages to make elements like the killer Christmas tree seem, if not actually scary, then actually not as ridiculous and cringeworthy as they might have seemed in the Slitheen two-parter, so that's a big difference. The Sycorax themselves aren't particularly memorable monsters, but the story doesn't need them to be. With their cavern-like spaceship and use of pseudo-magical blood-based technology, they are distinctive without distracting from what's going on with the Doctor and Rose. Davies' cleverest touch is to leave the Sycorax language untranslated while the Doctor is asleep, as the commander feels so much more alien and menacing when we actually don't know what he's ranting about. But the second that the TARDIS starts translating again and the Doctor arrives on screen, the show feels rather safe again, which rather ingeniously plays on the psychology of the viewers. But that moment does pay off rather well, and the first inkling of the Tennant's Doctor we get in that scene is rather good, spriting dialogue that will become rather commonplace throughout his era. Obviously the Sycorax don't look like real aliens.
I speak only Sycoraxic!
I can hear English. And it's being translated. Which means it's working. Which means...
Did you miss me? Was I out there?
Oh, dear!
You just can't get the staff. Now you just wait. I'm busy.
If I might interrupt,
Yes, sorry. Hello, big fella.
who exactly are you?
Well, that's the question.
I demand to know who you are! I don't know!
See, that's the thing. I'm a doctor, but beyond that, I just don't know. I literally do not know who I am. It's all untested. Am I funny? Am I sarcastic? Sexy? Wild misery? Life and soul? Right-handed, left-handed, a gambler, a fighter, a coward, a traitor, a liar, a nervous wreck. I mean, judging by the evidence, I've certainly got a gob.
Obviously the Sycorax don't look like real aliens. We know for a fact they don't look like real Martians, for a start, but they feel rather more plausible and unsettling when they actually start speaking in an alien language. Once the Sycorax leader starts speaking English, it suddenly feels like there's nothing to worry about, because the audience is allowed to remember that this is all make-believe. Technically speaking, I suppose this reveals the essential silliness of Doctor Who, and make no mistake, this is a proudly silly show. But in this moment, this undermining of the Sycorax leader only serves to emphasise how powerful the Doctor really is. He's playing with the Sycorax from the moment he opens the TARDIS doors, give or take the moment he kills the commander with a well-aimed Satsuma. The Doctor's...
No second chances. I'm that sort of a man.
The Doctor's subsequent line, in which he coldly declares that he is not the sort of man who offers second chances, has to be the most important thing that the Doctor says in the Christmas Invasion, and we'll have to pay attention over the coming weeks as to how this Doctor really stands by that unforgiving credo. Again, this is a sort of statement one can imagine the Ninth Doctor making, but it's harder to imagine following through on it like his successor does here. The previous Doctor, for all his grim bluster, was often too racked by self-doubt to take decisive action, particularly once Rose helped him reconnect with his compassion, and, if you forget the anthropocentrism, his humanity. Yes, he let Lady Cassandra die in his second story, but it wasn't long after he couldn't bring himself to actually shoot a Dalek. Again, I think it's self-doubt that is the key concept here. The Ninth Doctor's arc was about him becoming the Doctor once again after his actions in the Time War. His parting gift to his successor is a renewed belief in himself as a Doctor, and we see both the light and the dark side of that here on display.
And now I know what sort of man I am. I'm lucky, because quite by chance, I'm still within the first 15 hours of my regeneration cycle, which means I've got just enough residual cellular energy to do this.
Witchcraft.
Time Lord.
The Doctor's six-word ouster of Harriet Jones shows just how far we've come since Boomtown, in which the last Doctor was shaken by self-serving arguments of an admitted murderer. Harriet's decision to destroy the retreating Sycorax is at best morally dubious, and it's questionable whether the British Prime Minister really has the authority to take such unilateral action on the entire world's behalf, but some of her arguments carry real weight. The Doctor's defeat of the Sycorax was treated as such a foregone conclusion that he barely bothered to take them seriously, which does rather ignore the fact that David Llewellyn and Major Blake had suffered horrible deaths at the hands of the Sycorax leader just moments before. The Doctor wasn't to know of those deaths, but that's the point. His perspective is that of an alien wanderer, someone who is removed enough from the everyday affairs of mortals that doesn't actually notice when they die. It's worth debating whether that's really a good deal, especially when Earth can't rely on him to show up in time, but this isn't Doctor Who that seems interested in.
Don't you think she looks tired?
The Christmas Invasion is at best a solid episode of Doctor Who, but it doesn't aspire to be anything more than that. This story is one of several of Davies' efforts that could be described as epic, and that doesn't refer to the scale of the Sycorax threat. This is a story full of big speeches, big emotions and big moments. There's precious little subtlety in the Doctor's monologues about his search for identity. The Doctor saying the Sycorax summed him up when he calls him the world's champion is rather clunkily on the nose, and Rose's emotional breakdown when she thinks the Doctor has abandoned her is played a bit bigger than it really needs to be. The Sycorax themselves are strictly functional monsters, although they do at least set up the Doctor and Harriet Jones's rift, which stands as the most intriguing element of this episode, if only because it's not immediately obvious what we in the audience are meant to make of it. After the madcap fearlessness that typified Davies' final 3 episodes for the Ninth Doctor, this episode certainly feels like the show is playing it safe once again. That's understandable though, really. Hard as it is to imagine now, the Doctor Who creative team couldn't have known for certain in the fall of 2005 the audiences would stay after the show of Christopher Eccleston's departure, so it made sense to tread lightly here. Yes, there was a period, however brief, where people weren't entirely sure that the world would accept David Tennant as a Doctor. No, I can't quite believe it either. Overall, the Christmas Invasion sets up for the show's second season effectively, but it's more significant than that. It is an episode that acts as the first Christmas special. The Christmas special will become a staple of both the Davies and Moffat eras of Doctor Who in years to follow, and so this was a debut and had to succeed, and of course it did. If this episode hadn't been successful, then we may never have got any further Yuletide specials. However, you can't ignore the fact that the Sycorax are fairly forgettable and unmemorable villains, but however, they serve their purpose here effectively. However, the standout for me is the return of Harriet Jones, and of course UNIT, and our first hint of the new story arc for the series, Torchwood. Nevertheless, I'd argue that this is a fairly strong episode, but however, it cannot surpass anything above a 7.5 for me. It certainly isn't a bad episode.